Back there. My name is Susan Miller Havens, and I'm the director of the Department of Education, the AAC. I'm also a psychologist and researcher, and I've been a psychotherapist for the last 20 years. What I want to talk today about has to do with what I'm calling blows to the self, the issue of loss for all members of the triad. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask was, how many of you are clinicians yourselves? Okay. And the rest of you, I assume, are triad members? Is that fair? Okay. One of the purposes of this workshop is really to discuss some of the issues that all individuals who are taking care of members of the triad need to consider. And I do admit that this is slanted very much towards clinicians. So those who are members of the triad, please bear with some of the boring intellectual exercises that our teachers have put us through. But I also would like you to contribute and we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. What I want to do is to go over what I see as the normal, I hate to use the word, normal experience of loss. And then to talk a little bit about what healthy grieving is, a little bit about what grieving that gets stuck is about, or truncated grieving. And then to say something about a kind of historical overview of the way other clinicians have looked at loss for members of the triad. Then what we know now, and then I'd like to make some suggestions for what we as clinicians can do now in our own practice. And I think one of the places that I like to start is that it doesn't matter if you're an adoptee, a birth mother, or a birth father, an adoptive parent. There's no one in this room, I would venture to guess, who has escaped loss in their lives. And I'm defining loss in two ways. One, by indicating that loss can be through the death of someone who has meant something to you. Loss can also be the loss of a relationship, the end of something that's meant a great deal to you. Now, I don't mean there aren't other losses in life, but these are the two that I'm going to focus on. And most of us don't have a lot of trouble grieving in a healthy way when we know and believe that the person who we have lost is actually dead, or that that person no longer loves us, and that's clear, that the relationship is over. In the case of death, we've all had, in any society, religion and rituals that aid us in saying goodbye to someone. So you have funerals, you have wakes, people go to the cemetery, some people need to touch the body, all kinds of things that before there was any psychiatry, any psychological thought, people practiced for millions of years to know that someone was gone for sure. In the case of a love relationship that's ended, it might take many, many attempted efforts at finding in that relationship some sort of life before we give up. When someone who you love a great deal says, "Look, dearie, it's all over," there aren't many of us who are going to say, "Oh, okay, that's fine, that's great, that didn't mean anything to me, I'll just go on with my life." There still takes a long time for people to believe that it's over. Now, the other question is, how do people really give things up? How do you go on after a loss? What is meant by healthy grief? Whatever any of you think about Freud in terms of his instinct theories, in terms of his inability to understand women at the time that he was at work, One of his greatest contribution came out of a paper that he wrote in 1917, which is called Mourning and Melancholia. It is dry, it's boring, it's a difficult paper, but it is the center of what we know today in psychiatry, the process of mourning and saying goodbye. And what he meant by mourning was grieving. What he meant by melancholia was what happens to you when you don't grieve. And melancholic states are the things that those of you who are familiar with these awful DSM-3 categories of depressive this and depressive that. That's what he meant. Anything that sometimes would reach psychotic proportions, but most often depression. This is horrendous to try to summarize this paper, but I think for our purposes, the most important point is that what he observed in his patients was that grief cannot occur unless an individual is able to acknowledge both the positive and negative aspects of the relationship, the person that they loved. Without that, he demonstrated that people get into lots of trouble in terms of trying to go on with their lives. I also just want you to keep in mind that when Freud was writing, this was during the time in a Victorian society when feelings were not meant to be expressed. They were meant to be kept in. This paper was not well received in 1917. It doesn't really come into use until much later. In my own experience, I had a teacher in the 50s and 60s who took this piece up and demonstrated once again, except in a clinical situation in a hospital setting, the principle of trying to deal with loss by positive and negative grieving, in that he could, in an interview with someone who was chronically depressed or acutely psychotic, assume that loss was at the center and go to that loss and clear a person up in one interview by getting to the bottom of that. Now he happened to be very skilled at that. It's not easy, but he was working over this idea that if you get stuck, your psyche is not going to be able to function in the way that you would hope. Okay, so just in summary, in the first part, nobody avoids loss, and mostly our society provides us with an opportunity to aid in grieving, acknowledging that there were positive and negative features to the lost individual provides psychological resolution in both adults and children. By the way, the child analysts came along and said to Freud, look, you forgot about all the kids. People like Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham and John Bowlby said kids grieve too, and so this got added on later on. And I should say, this is also when the practice of adoption is coming into being, because during World War I and World War II, there were an abundance of orphans, and that's when you find Bowlby and Burlingham and all these people making these observations. Okay, so now if we keep all of this in mind, what happens if there's no body to bury? What if you don't know if the person is dead? How are you supposed to grieve? Well, the example that I like to use for those of you who are not members of the Triad is the families of the MIAs, the missing in action. They are still, to this day, looking for bodies to bury. They have got to have a piece of their lost son or daughter from Vietnam to bury or to bring home, because they cannot grieve without it. What I think in this is also, what if your person who you feel you love won't tell you that it's over? What if you don't know whether the relationship is going to work or not? You can't grieve, you can't do much except to wait. And what if society does not embrace Freud's hypothesis? What if the grief resolution, if it requires a body, some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of confrontation with a lost one, what if society doesn't support this? Well, what I want to argue is that that is exactly the set of circumstances the members of the adoption triad have faced since the practice of closed adoption began. In 1917 was the date that the first records were sealed in the United States. It is also the date of the publication of Mourning and Melancholia. No one paid any attention to that paper. It's only a coincidence that it was written in the same year. But he was publishing this paper that said you must be open, you must grieve, you must talk about your feelings, you must find the person and say goodbye, when our society was saying we must protect birth mothers, adoptive parents, and adoptees from the pain of loss and the embarrassment of their sexual acts and/or infertility. We will encourage denial, not acknowledgement. This is a paradox which has been perpetuated through social agencies, well-meaning, thinking that it is better in such a painful situation to just deny it and, as Ken Watson said this morning, go on with your life. So there's the social scene. I mean, you have this very powerful set of situations. You've also got the war with many orphans. This is not a bunch of adopted parents looking for kids. These are war orphans. They're all over the place. And the idea was to hurry up and place them and make them forget. In many situations, their parents were dead. So what we had then were some psychologists looking to see how would these kids do, how would they bear the loss, etc. But still, there wasn't a lot of talking about it. Now, what I want to do is to just review very briefly about what they did say they thought our issues were at that time. So this is around maybe 1919. And I also want you to keep in mind that there was very little known then about early infancy, the effects of relinquishment, the medical reasons for infertility. And also you should keep in mind that the Freudians were working within a model of drives and instincts. Much of what you might read in their work is going to talk a lot about what the motivations were. Why did women get pregnant? Why were adoptive parents infertile? There was a lot of trying to explain it using a Freudian model. And I am not going to discuss the different approaches to that. I don't personally embrace the instinct model, and I don't think it's relevant at the moment for what we're talking about. What is relevant is the common denominator of loss for all members of the triad. I want to start for no particular reason with what they said about infertility. Helena Deutsch, who many of you have probably heard of, was working in 1944. And she, because again of the war, was taking care of a lot of birth mothers, and she also had contact with some of their children. It's interesting to note that she actually herself had struggled with infertility, and although her family didn't wish her biographer to reveal it, had at one point had an abortion herself, and then eventually did have a child later in life. She was very concerned with the workings, as she called it, the female body, and she struggled a great deal with what might constitute the experience for an infertile mother. And this is a quotation, so this is 1919. Adoption constitutes an attempt to remedy a severe trauma, and this trauma must be overcome before motherliness and its gratifications can fully develop. What deprivations must the sterile adoptive mother endure? Well, they consist above all in the foregoing of the emotional experiences that accompany the biological process of motherhood. The gratifying inversion of pregnancy with its absorption in the promising future, the gradual maturation of the fantasy of a child to its reality, the uncomfortable and yet satisfying yielding of the woman's own organs to prepare a dwelling place to something that is only developing. The fantasies about what sort of being the child will be, the active and joyful preparation of a nest, are all denied to the adoptive mother. Both the woman and man are deprived of the realization of the wish for physical immortality. Now, many of you may correct me on this, but I don't believe that at any point that she really relates this experience for the adoptive, infertile, potentially adoptive mother, but for the infertile woman as an experience of loss. She does not talk about how the infertile woman is to deal with this. What she's describing is what she hears her patients telling her. Now she also had an opinion on what birth mothers were attempting to do. Again, this was in the 1940s. Deutsch believed that the birth mother attempted through relinquishment to resolve the conflict between society's views and that of her own inner life. She believed that this worked only if the woman had gone through the full experience of what she called frustration, disappointment, and here's the word I'm sure you're going to love, renunciation. She gave examples of women experiencing acute anxiety reactions following the birth of their next child, for instance. Now, I mean, we know that, but she stops there. She's not going to tell us anything about what's happened here to the birth mother's experience of loss or what you would do as a clinician at this point. Florence Clothier, who was a woman who worked in Boston. She was a psychoanalyst who was at the Home for Little Wanderers, which is an orphanage still in existence today. You like the name of the Home for Little Wanderers? During the war, there was, and I should remember his name, but there was a very wealthy man who lived in Back Bay in Boston, and there were literally orphans on the street wandering around. And he bought a house, which is, it's still there in Jamaica Plain, and he literally brought the babies, the wanderers, off the street. And today it's an enormous operation, and it actually does house many homeless children. And it's almost as bad as that WAIFs organization Ken was talking about this morning. Anyway, at that time, she questioned the value of a trial period, and those of you who are social workers may know the history of these experiments about how long does the baby stay with the birth mother and does she see the child, etc. Florence Clothier questioned the value of the trial period of several months during which the mother was given an opportunity to decide whether or not to retain custody of her baby. She liked to compare the loss of the mother whose baby dies with the other who loses her baby during or after the nursing period. She said the mother who after 1 to 6 months, now these mothers are seeing these babies somewhere, in foster care or in the hospital. The mother who after 6 months gives up her baby loses not only the product of her conception and whatever it may have stood for her in fantasy, but she also loses a baby with whose personality her own has become inextricably interwoven. She did not think this was a great idea to have babies stay with their birth mothers over that period of time. There's a lot of disagreement about that, and there probably still is today. Because Florence Clothier was surrounded by hundreds of orphans for many years at this home, she wrote a considerable amount about it. And one of the striking things to me that in 1943 she wrote a paper about the experience for adoptees, which is probably someone would be hard-pressed to improve on today. And this is just this is her first paragraph. Every adopted child at some point in his development has been deprived of this primitive relationship with his mother. This trauma and the severing of the individual from his racial antecedents lie at the core of what is peculiar to the psychology of the adopted child. But the ego of the adopted child, in addition to all the normal demands made upon it, is called upon to compensate for the wound left by the loss of the biological mother. Later on, this appears as an unknown void. We've heard the word void over and over and over again. This paper is, I mean, it's hard to find it. You have to get the library to search for it. It was never put into a book, just something she put out because this is what she learned from those kids who she knew so well. So Deutsch and Clothier and Anna Freud and Bowlby did a lot of observation of what loss was during the war, mostly for orphans. Not a lot of suggestions for resolution. Although Bowlby said fantasy only stops when the searching stops. He had no idea what he was talking about in terms of adult adoptees. What he saw were these little kids in orphanages literally looking around to see if they could find their mothers. Okay, now what do we know now, or what do we think we know now? For one thing, since Vietnam and civil rights and the women's movement, our society has undergone considerable amount of change in terms of openness of people speaking out for what they believe in. Psychotherapy certainly has become much more acceptable, if not in some areas of this country, expected. The points in Freud's paper are taught in Mourning and Melancholia, are taught routinely to anybody who goes through social work school, medical school, psychology, whatever. It is a basic text. There are many spin-offs from it, but essentially the paper is something that all of us have been exposed to. The thing that I found perplexing is that there are many clinicians who are still not aware that investing loss in triad members is absolutely essential, and it's often unresolved. It's often an unresolved issue for all three sides. It still is not on, and correct me, I do not know of any intake sheets in clinics or hospitals or elsewhere in which an individual is asked whether they are a birth mother, an adoptee, or an adoptive parent. And this has serious medical ramifications as well, as you all know, that there's then, no medical history. Now, in terms of what we know now about infertility, I will not bore you with what all the developments and all the causes and all the numerous diagnostic tests that are available today. Some successful treatments and lots of national support groups to help people deal with loss. But what I wanted to do was to read a passage from a woman who had just found that she would not ever be able to bear children, which I think expresses it in our language today and more clearly than what the clinicians understood then. Reality was bitterness and anger, anguish, incomprehension, a sense of loss so deep and so severe that I was sure that some organ had been removed from my body, leaving in its place a gaping wound, a psychological hurt that no one could ever really see, and a few would even comprehend a little bit more than self-indulgent. In terms of relinquishment, I mentioned before the women's movement, I think, has helped, and support groups have helped women come out of the closet, as they say, and not hide themselves. They've been very brave and come forward to volunteer for all kinds of research projects, and really begun their search. They also have begun to speak in therapy about the fact that their loss is not resolved, that they cannot grieve without knowing what has actually happened to their child. This woman says, "It was pushed back into the unconscious where it proceeded to wreak havoc. My son's loss was so well repressed that 11 years later, suffering from severe and unexplained depression, I had not even mentioned to my therapist that I had surrendered a child for adoption." I cannot tell you how common that is. Therapists do not ask people if they have ever relinquished. And how many people are just going to say, "Here I am, I'm feeling really lousy, and and it must have to do with the fact that I relinquished a child." Many people are not aware of that. It's very deep, it's very old, and it's embarrassing for a lot of people. In terms of adoptees, what we know about infant development since Freud has really grown leaps and bounds, and researchers, they're called the infant researchers, and they talk a lot about the fact that theories such as Freud's really rely on a kind of cognition, a kind of way of remembering what happened to define early child development, and that it really misses the pre-verbal capabilities infants possess. And they've been able to demonstrate now that infants do not need to be able to think or to talk to you to experience a feeling. And of course, this research supports Bowlby's argument that loss in infancy is experienced by infants, but they can't talk about it. What it becomes is a kind of a residue of something missing. If you speak to your adoptive clients, they might talk about feeling like, well, I'm not too sure, there's something missing here, I'm not too sure what it is. Oh no, it's not a big deal, but sometimes it really doesn't feel right. And this quotation comes out of some research that I've been doing, and I think it sort of says it pretty simply, from an adoptee, a young woman about 25. "I have always felt apart from life, unconnected. Not that I did not feel love, or in turn love, to be able to love. The point is, I was missing a piece of myself, some valuable link that somehow left me in complaint." So she's not complaining that she can't love or that other people don't love her, but there's just something missing that doesn't seem right. Well, so what are you supposed to do as clinicians, and what are those of you who have had experience talking to people in the helping profession, what are you hoping that they may get to when they speak with you? First of all, I want to emphasize again for the clinicians, don't assume because someone doesn't volunteer information that they're not a member of the triad. And don't assume that an adoptee who says she's an adoptee is not also a birth mother or an adoptive parent. And really think seriously about incorporating those kinds of questions in your intake sheets, or suggesting that the agency does, or the clinic that you work for. Now the question is, well, what do people do anyway if they're clinicians and they know that someone has experienced a loss? They're going to tell them, okay, now we're going to work this thing through. And I'm just going to use the model from Elvin Semrad, who was a teacher of mine who I mentioned before, who demonstrated a very simple formula. He said, first of all, you've got to get the person to acknowledge there was a loss. Now, for members of the triad, if you're clinicians, that might take a long time. That could take a year to acknowledge that anything has been lost, because some people have really been worked over, and they've been told, you forget it, you forget it, you forget it, and pretty soon it goes underground. So step one, you've got to acknowledge the loss. If the loss then becomes available, then what about all the pain? The message that Semrad said was that you're going to have to sit there and you're going to have to do all the crying that you never did before. And the third part was incorporating the Freudian suggestion of, okay, let's talk about what was good about Harry, what I loved about Harry, what I hated about Harry, and then let's say goodbye to Harry and let's get on with our lives. That's a really distilled point of view of the grief process. Well, but how can you do this if someone's infertile? How are you going to run this little routine over somebody who is experiencing loss, as this woman said early, of a part of her body, of what she thought was her immortality in some way? Some of our religions do things like bury miscarriages, bury pieces of body. You know, there are those sorts of rituals. But I found that a woman who had really figured out, I think, and gives a good example of what you would hope for as an individual who does have to come to terms with this, and what you would hope you would get to if you were in therapy with someone or in a group. This woman is asked by the worker at Resolve, where she was going, about her infertility problems, to bring in baby clothing, to talk about the baby that she had wanted to have, and she said no way, this was not going to be it for her. She would have to deal with this herself. And here she is, she's going to do this whole thing that we just suggested, except she's not an Elvin Semrad or a Sigmund Freud or anything else. She says to herself, how could I mourn when there was no body? Each of those 60 months I could try desperately not to build up my hopes. But the secret thoughts would creep in, and the baby names would filter through. Each month, the imaginary presence would dissolve in a pool of blood. It was a death only I saw and only I felt. No one else did. Who feels for the unformed life? Well, she doesn't know what to do about it, and she has purchased a doll that she was going to give if she ever had a child. And this is, I mean, this breaks me up every time I read it. I will dress the doll I dared to buy, kiss her goodbye, and bury her in my flower garden. At the end of it, she says, you have to find the body and bury it. You have to grieve and then go on living. She has said she has experienced the same thing that took many, many years for some of the most important psychoanalysts around to figure out, only she does it better. She knows, she teaches us what it's like, and she teaches her therapist what it's like, so it's, you know, it's a two-way street. For adult birth parents and adoptees, there's no body to bury either, not in closed adoption. There's no one who says, I don't love you anymore. Did a relinquished child say, I don't want my mother? Did birth mothers really say, I don't want this child? So how are they going to resolve their grief? Somehow, like this, when I was telling you about the MIA, somehow there's got to be a way to bury the body or say goodbye to the relationship if there's going to be one. We know that denying has not always been a helpful defense. We know that now. We didn't know that before. The losses in the triad are not the same, but what is the same is the process is the same for all three. So there's no body, there's no rejection. The relinquished child, as far as you know, is not dead. And for the adoptee, the birth family, as far as they know, is not dead. So what do you do if you're the therapist? somehow you've got to either help them find that body or you've got to help them deal with a rejection. This means they have to complete the searching behavior that they have most likely kept in their fantasy life. And I'll tell you, if any member of the triad tells you they've never had a fantasy about their situation, then you know you've even got more trouble, because they're socked in with denial. And you've got a problem on your hands. So you want to try to find some evidence, and you know it's going to be painful. But what it means is that there's got to be searching. And in order to search, that takes affect tolerance. And that means, all that's a fancy word for saying is that you got to be able to stand the pain to do it. And those who criticize us, particularly criticize the AAC, and those of us who believe in openness, like to say that searching is unhealthy, that only those people who are unhappy search. I argue that it's the other way around, that only those people who are healthy and know that they must deal with their losses search. And eventually, I think what we'll see is that those people who belong to other organizations which are just full of denial, particularly the Bill Pierce's organization, they're telling people to just forget and go on. And I'm arguing the other direction. Okay, so here you are, and you're going to help this person to search, but does it matter what they find? A lot of therapists won't do it. Oh no, it's going to be a nightmare. What if the birth mother is dead? What if the child has been killed? What will we do? No, we're not going to do that. What I would argue is that, going back to the beginning of this, what we said, what we've been taught, is that in order to resolve grief, in order to go on, you've got to be able to say goodbye to what happened before. If you or your client finds a death, then you can mourn it. You can go to the grave. You can do as much as possible to say goodbye. You can know that that individual is dead. What if there's a rejection? What if the birth family or the adoptee says, I don't want you in my life? It is no different than someone else who you care a great deal about saying, no, we're not going to have a relationship. Then, as sad as it is, you have the opportunity to acknowledge they're alive, but it's not going to work, and say goodbye. If there is a reunion in which there's acceptance on both sides, we're not talking about loss. We might be talking about loss of years that perhaps could have been spent together, but what you're really talking about is that the end of a very long separation has come to a close, and then you can get on with your life. So, in conclusion, and I hope that you will all have things that you want to talk about, just going back to the beginning of this talk, clinical training has included for all of us the instructions for guiding and counseling our patients or clients or whatever through grief resolution. We know that resolution of loss produces mental health. That's a fact. It's a fact for all people. The questions that I want to leave you with are, why is it that some clinicians are reluctant to aid members of the adoption triad in achieving a similar state of mental health? Is it possible that the clinicians in the 1990s still embrace society's point of view that supports denial and repression of loss as in the best interest of the triad members? Is that possible, that they still really believe that? Are we practicing good medicine or good psychology when we inadvertently ally ourselves with really what is a legal and societal attitude of closeness? It's not what we've been taught psychologically. And is that good preventative mental health? That's another thing that everybody always talks about, preventing things. I'm not suggesting that any of you clinicians become political activists. But I am suggesting for those who hesitate to encourage their clients to resolve their grief in the same way as you do a non-triad member, that you might need to examine your own feelings about maybe closed records, maybe what you think is good or not good for people to do in our society. And for those of you who are triad members yourselves, who have been to therapists and tried to grieve your loss, or have been told, grieve, when you have not been given the body or the rejection or the opportunity to search, be wary. You don't have to stay with that therapist. You can fire them, you know. You're paying them a lot of money usually. But I think it's quite a paradox that on one hand, as professionals, we've been taught to do one thing, and it is not being applied by and large to triad members. Any questions? Yeah.
In the process of actively mourning, the grieving person feels a connectedness with the one they've lost, and there is sometimes a tendency to perpetuate that connectedness because that's all of the person they have. Could you discuss being stuck in that stage and how to move beyond?
You're talking about, this would be a triad member who was trying to mourn, or anybody?
Well, I guess it could generalize, but specific to the triad members.
Well, do you want to stand up and say it again? Just turn around so they can hear you, okay?
My question was that in the process of actively mourning, the grieving person feels a connectedness with the person they lost. And there's a tendency sometimes to perpetuate that connectedness and remain in a state of mourning. My question was what to do to move beyond that.
And you were thinking about somebody who had relinquished, or you're thinking, because in general, if you're talking about a non-adoptee, and you're talking about someone who is unwilling to give up their beloved husband, let's say, and they keep mourning and mourning and mourning, and you can't get them off base. Freud would argue that they have not been able to really talk about the negative things about that individual. In other words, you can keep a person alive by saying he was the most wonderful person on earth. I will never say goodbye to him. He is not dead. In fact, I will remain depressed forever. And they get terribly stuck. I don't know whether you're thinking about a particular individual or not, but in general, you've got to be able to deal with the whole person, the negative part of that individual who they've lost before they can get on. With a triad member, they can't even get that far because they may be longing, they may be sad, they may be longing for the child they relinquished. The adoptive mother may be longing in fantasy for pregnancy to occur, or the adoptee may have adoptees tend to have lots and lots of fantasies that they carry around with them about what the birth mother is like, and they keep her. As one adoptee told me, my mother will always be 24. It was the only piece of information she had, and in some of my work on this fantasy formation is where you find these elaborate, beautiful stories, and there's no mourning there. They're connected, and nothing's going to happen until something is found. Yeah?
Just picking up where this lady left off, what do you do when there's a situation that you can't really grieve because you know that the person is still there and you're just waiting for the relationship to improve? I've had a situation with my birth mother who's told me she doesn't want a relationship with her daughter, who knows that I'm around but hasn't come forward, and I
That's right.
It's still there,
You're stuck.
like I am.
Yeah. Well, one thing was, you're talking about a birth mother, right, of yours. You're not convinced she doesn't want to have anything to do with you yet, right?
No, not convinced of that. And
Right.
also there's like 5 siblings too that are kind of
Yeah. Well, you don't have anything to grieve yet because you haven't. You know, it's like the story of the.
This is what I can't get over, like 5 years. It goes on. And when does it end? You know, the only part I can relate to in what you say
Yeah.
is it ends when she dies.
No, it ends when you get sick and tired of trying. When you are finished trying to get her to get into some kind of a relationship, it depends. I mean, you might work on this for another 5 years, and then you might say, it's just not going to work. You might develop a relationship with your siblings. There's no reason to give up on that, and you don't know what's going to happen in terms of your own daughter. You're just suspended. You can't grieve yet. And that's one of the things that's so terribly uncomfortable. Think about how many years those of us who have been involved in the triad have not been able to grieve. Grieving is not a negative kind of thing that goes on. It's a very positive thing. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, isn't that the crux of the whole issue, really, in terms of what is fantasy and what is not? And really, for the adoptee and for the birth, it is normal to have that fantasy, and possibly normalizing that is the first step. If you're dealing with someone that is stuck, and most of us are, until we are able to physically search or decide to take those risks and go through that process. And I would think that might be the first step in terms of trying to change the system and trying to change that to a fantasy of someone that you don't know, and that is perfectly okay to do. And that maybe is the first step.
In terms of educating clinicians, particularly because
How about in terms of the clients, the psychotherapy clients, in terms of the counselor person, to affirm with them that is perfectly normal to have this feeling.
well, that's one of our big tasks, is to educate that fantasy formation in the triad is the way that we deal with what we have not been allowed to deal with. Fantasy is not, there can be some negative connotations to fantasy formation. There have been non-members of the triad, may say, well, she's in fantasy land, right? That's not a positive connotation, but fantasy is the only place you can put this stuff.
True. And what I'm saying is that since that may be also a realistic fact,
Right.
that while the adoptee is gathering steam, so to speak, in order to physically search, to normalize that right there is the first step in therapy.
May very well be, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
There is another step that I think is common that we haven't talked about, which is reformulation of meaning. When any kind of crisis happens and you lose something, you have to make sense out of what happened. And one thing that's hard, I think, in her case, is she can't make sense out of what's happened because nothing
Right.
is finished. But there's also a stage where you can mourn for your fantasies. I mean, when I was in that position with my son, and what I had to do was mourn the loss of the son I thought I had because, in fact, he never existed. I mean, for 20 years, I had my idea of my son. Well, he wasn't. He was someone else's son by the time I found him. And it was a long mourning period of mourning the loss of that fantasy. That person didn't exist. Now there's another person. And then you have to make some sense out of the experience that's here and now, but not until you grieve the death of your fantasy.
That's right.
I've had feels.
Yeah.
I think speaking as a birth mother, I found my daughter about 14, well, I made a contact with her about 14 months ago, but I've had no response except she's not ready. Fantasies are the only way I get through it sometimes.
That's right.
I mean, I try to look, another birth mother told me that no matter what you think of what your reunion is going to be. It's going to be something else. And you can think of 1,000 things, but it's not going to be any one of those. And I swear I've thought of every one of them, whether they were bad or good. But, and sometimes I think, I don't know if it's because of the mood I'm in or what it is, but I do go through the bad fantasies too of, you know, having her come up and saying, you know, just bug off, leave me alone, go away, I never want to see you again. And I think that's the only way I make it through some of the bad times. And, you know, I think you do have to fantasize, and maybe that helps you get through it. And I've had other birth mothers tell me the same thing.
Well, I think it's helped many more people than we know through it, because lots of people won't tell you what their fantasies are. And it is not negative. And those of you who are here already know that, or you wouldn't be at this conference. You know, there are a lot of people who just will say, I never thought about it. Never entered my mind. I have no fantasies whatsoever. And in answer to your question, you know, that means they haven't even gotten to the first step of wondering what happened to them. Yeah.
Speaking as a birth parent, first of all, and an adoptive parent as well, and someone who works with members of the triad, you're going to realize more and more that what we experience in life is a lifetime of losses around so many of these issues and the challenges of families. You can sort of focus on one loss at a time. You can't bring it all at once. Several of the young ladies that are working with seem to be stuck around in the anger stage. And the anger is so often directed toward those who were with her during the process of the planning of the adoption. And anger at the birth father, anger at the
Is this the adoptee or a birth mother?
I'm talking about birth mother specifically right now. Anger is so much at the fathers that they don't feel the loss. They think that no one else feels the loss that they feel. And so they just are really stuck there because they sort of can't get beyond that, beyond that point. They want them to hurt as much as they hurt.
There's a lot of unfinished business, isn't it?
And I think to realize that in adoption, you go through a lifetime of grieving. You grieve a little bit here and a little bit there, but I don't think it's ever finished. And to realize that it's not even finished and it's okay, that it's a process, it's a journey, and I don't know if you'll ever know that journey's finished.
Are there any adoptive parents here? Can you speak to whether or not people helped you resolve your losses? Can you speak louder or stand up? I think the people in the back can't hear a thing.
I'm also a birth parent as well as an adoptive parent, and my son that I'm raising is 17-year-old, and the daughter that I'm raising, they're both from South America, and my little girl's going to be 8 next year, so I have a 7 and 17-year-old, and my 17-year-old was then 10 when we went to adopt my daughter, and he went with me to adopt her, to bring her back, as they have to do with a particular orphanage, and researched for his birth family in Colombia, in Bogota, where we wanted to get my daughter, and he was going through a process of grieving in a way that we weren't able to find anything over there. We have brothers and sisters, and he had parents and a grandmother. And when we went, we could find nothing. And I was going through this whole process with him. And it was healing for me that, in a way, we couldn't find anything, and I thought this will help him, and it was helping me that we have to put this dead stop, so to speak, because I was grieving for the loss of the 2 sons that I had relinquished when I was young, that I had taken out of the closet with 2 years ago. But the whole process of my son being unable to find anything, I was also dealing with my loss, and I was trying to tell my son, it's all right to grieve for them, Matthew. difficult for me at the same time because I knew that I did not know where my sons were. It was a double whammy for me because no one knew at that point of my loss. And my son now is still grieving for that, and I cannot help him in any way. The records are destroyed over there as soon as you are adopted. I'm very angry about that, but that's the laws over there. I was the only help that Matthew had. He was never led through a process when we adopted him. The agency went through it. Which wonderful boy. Bag of garbage. There was no one to help him, and there was no one to help me help him, and I never had any help with my loss, double losses, relinquishments, until I was able to come to adoption information direction. And now this, there was never anyone there to help. But I think my being a birth parent and able to put things into perspective for my son, that's the way that he was being helped.
Yeah.
And until I did tell him 2 years ago after I was searched for him, what I had to share with him, and he put his arms around me and said, Mom, now I know why you understood what I was going through. But if I hadn't been a birth parent, I don't know if I could have related to it. I don't know. I don't know if I could have understood his loss. And as an adopted parent, my adoption for the other side of my children, I have a difficult time in getting these parents understand this loss is real, understand that they need to know their roots, they need to have this brought out to them, they need to know that you feel love for these people that had to give up their children to another type of parents. And I'm not getting too told. I don't know if I could have done this. I really don't know if I hadn't been on one of the other sides of the tree.
What about some of the adopted parents? Can you respond to this lady? Yeah?
I'm not an adopted parent, but is this session being recorded? Do you know?
Yeah, it is.
This stuff will never come out. I bought tapes from last year's, the speaker was great, but I couldn't hear anything anyone said, and it's not going to come out until I do. There's a lot of good things being said, so I'm just going to make a suggestion.
I don't know whether this thing, it's something we can carry around. Let me see if I can.
Should just pull out.
All right, hold your ears. I'm gonna. Oh, look at this wire. Wait a minute. Well, you're gonna have to still come up somewhere. I think that's it. What?
Wouldn't it be also on the recording being done by your microphone on your bell?
Right, but that's not going to help with the audience. Okay, what brave soul is going to come right up here? Could we hear some more from maybe from the adoptive parents? Do you want to come up?
I'm an adoptive parent, but I'm also a natural parent, so it gives a little bit different slant because of the fact that we adopted our daughter through my doctor, and so he delivered all 3 of the children. I didn't experience any losses because of the fact that in the beginning I wasn't sure if I was ever going to be able to have any children, but I was very excited with the fact to adopt, and I felt like we were really blessed in that after we had our boy and then we adopted a girl, I said it was more fun to adopt than it was to even have our own. But see, then I was able to experience both. I felt very, very bad from the very beginning because I really felt that I needed some information from my daughter. And I was so afraid that if I would say something to the attorney and ask him if we could have something, he would say, well, you can't have the baby. So I kept very, very quiet. And I said, someday I will be able to help my daughter find her parents. And I remember when she was just about 2 years old, and I would rock her, and I would cry, and I'd say, Lord, why can't I share her with her grandmother if her parents maybe just didn't feel they could handle it? Why can't I share her with her grandparents? I don't know why I felt that way, but we were very open with her, and still I know we did a lot of things wrong. I don't know if this is what you're really meaning for losses, or whatnot.
Well, there are tons of losses. We know that, and
And I'll try and hurry along then, because the fact that we tried to be very open with her from the time that she was 8, and I tried to tell her, let's not make any decisions and let's not make any judgments until we know, and when you're 18 we will try. Well, the doctor didn't tell me he was going to commit suicide, and so when he committed suicide, my first thought was, he's my main support team. And then the attorney, I thought I remembered that he said he would help when she was 18. Well, when she was 18, I called him. He said he'd look up the records, and 6 months later he says he'll look up the records, and 6 months later he said, yeah, I guess I'll look up the records. And finally he said, well, are you sure your daughter wants to do this? And I said, yes. So she went down there and said, yes, I want to find this out. And we started going to war meetings and doing a lot of things trying to support her and knowing just exactly, because I was very interested myself. I wanted to find her parents as much as she did, in fact, maybe more so at times. I don't really know. But in the process of trying to find her parents, my daughter perpetuated first mother syndrome and she got pregnant. And we had to relinquish that baby. It's been 2 years ago. It's been the hardest thing in my life to take that first grandchild of mine and give her away. She meant everything to me. But I said I felt she needed a mom and dad. I knew my daughter was in a place to keep her. I didn't feel that we were at the right age. I didn't really believe grandparents should raise children. I had a lot of preconceived ideas then. And a lot of this is still in the closet because it's been 2 years and I still haven't been able to deal with a lot of it, and that's why I'm here. But because of this process, we went to an agency and I said, I gotta have openness. I'll never let this happen again. Never will I let this happen again. And so we kept fighting, and of course they would go back, well, it's your daughter's decision. And I would say, yes, I know it is, but we were still sort of in control. At any time we knew we could have said, we are taking this baby, we're going home, and she would have said, yes. But we were still trying to let her be responsible, and still we were paying the bills. And then I found out birth grandmothers don't have any rights. And I'm here as a birth grandmother, and it's a triad. And I'm an adoptive parent, but also I feel like I'm a misplaced person because I'm a grandparent. Then I tried to bury the baby. She's still alive, I think. I knew the baby for 3 days. I saw her born. She was everything I ever wanted, and everything I hoped to be. It was just like my daughter. And it was like 21 years later, I'm giving away the thing that I was given in the hospital 21 years before. And all the mixed emotions of it was just more than I could really bear. But I said, okay, we'll do this as long as I know there's openness. Well, the agency, yes, but let's wait until the parents have settled down and then we'll approach them. Well, to skip along, the agency's lied to us. We have no way of knowing where my baby is. It's not really my baby, it's my grandbaby. My daughter is very upset. We even went to court to try and undo this so that we could make. We went to court just before the baby was a year old, only because of the fact that we felt if we nullified the adoption, then we could make a private adoption with the parents. But of course they did not know. So can you imagine how those adoptive parents feel about these terrible people? I found out later that the counselor that my daughter had, Brian said, I told you I wasn't sure if I could meet them, but I didn't care if my parents did. Well, they said then 6 months later, you said you didn't want to, we didn't think your folks were stable enough. And so somebody else made all my decisions for me. And we went to court to try and nullify it, but we were not able to do that, and so it just made it more of a mess. I was been sending gifts every birthday, Valentine's Day, and everything, not only to my baby, but to the other adopted child, so they can feel welcome. And they said they were accepting them and they wanted them. And then about a month ago, I got all the last gifts back that I sent, and they said they wanted no more gifts, no more letters, nothing for us. So I tried to bury the 3 days that we had with the baby because I don't know, that baby's gone. The baby that they named is 2 years old and I don't know her. So she's gone, she's dead to me. All I'm fighting for is the time when records are open, till the baby's 18, so that I can maybe see her again and tell her how much we did love her, how much we didn't want this to happen. I really feel that my daughter had a right to know more when she was younger. But they told me I had no right then. when she wanted to find out, when she told her counselor she wanted to find her parents, they said, we suggest you wait until after you have the baby. And we were really expecting to have a rejection and not to have any type of, we didn't really think the reunion would be any good, and Mike was horrified to think that maybe she would be left with a baby that had no support. So I was playing with all of these unknowns. About 6 months after we had the relinquished baby, we found out that they had given us closed profiles to choose from. And the reason why we chose this one, it was my husband's and my first choice, and then my daughter finally ended up choosing this one after she chose about 3 other ones, is because they seem to be so open, according to open adoption. And we're so glad that they were able to get gifts and letters from the birth mother and the birth grandparents. And of course, that's all it took for me. And so, what they said in their profile, I don't feel was true, because they never were very open with us from the very first letter. I dressed that baby up like she was the queen when I gave her, because I wanted to give that I gave somebody to be the best gift that could ever be given. But I loved her and I only wanted the best for her, but it turned out to be a nightmare. I mean, everything has gone wrong that could possibly go wrong. So I am suffering losses in a different aspect. My daughter, I should clarify the fact, we did find my daughter's birth parents in about 6 months after this all happened. And it was only because of going to the convention in Seattle 2 years ago, and then I really pushed, and I found an intermediary that helped me do the searching. I had to use every aspect of every person that I knew. I knew one of the head people at the county city building. He knew the head clerk of court. He told me that this judge would not sign the oath of records because he didn't believe in them, so he took it to another judge, and she signed it for him. If they wouldn't give me all these things, that we went through, and then we gave it to an intermediary, and she acted sort of on our behalf. But we signed the papers on Friday, she went to court on Tuesday. By Thursday night, the birth father was sitting in our living room 15 minutes after we talked to him. It just so happened we found him first. And she was born a 4th generation family from the city that we're from, which is she's got more wits than I got, and she grew up with this identity crisis of not knowing really who she was, and we had a lot of problems with her. And one of the things she said after she had the baby is, now I know how my birth mother felt. And I'm saying, do we have to keep the cycle going and going and going before we understand? I mean, I feel so guilty because I wasn't able to help her. I feel so guilty because I wasn't able to do something else. I feel so guilty because I gave my baby away. And then the attorney says, it's not your baby. I said, well, I took care of it for 3 days. They told me I couldn't take it home until we decided. They made her sign the papers right away. I said, had to go to foster home. Found out later we could have brought the baby home and taken it back to the agency 3 months later. But there were so many things. We only had 4 months to even go through all this because of, I would hope that they would have decided to get married. He came home from college. He didn't know anything about it. She didn't know she was pregnant. I mean, it's like, he didn't know what to do. So, we had nothing. And so I started going from one thing, dreams being shattered, to another thing until I ended up with ashes. And I don't even have enough ashes to put it together to make a vase that looks beautiful from broken ashes. So I'm here as not knowing where I'm at, not knowing what to do. They said I should be over this grieving process by now. And don't you think you could get on with your life? And I said, yeah, I guess I can when I find the baby. We found our daughter's parents, and that turned out to be a pretty good situation. I wish they were closer than they are, but I'm so thankful they didn't reject her. I might say that when we found him, the first thing I asked the birth fathers, I said, why didn't you ever contact the attorney? Because the attorney had told us at one time, all I can tell you is that they have never contacted me. So we felt like down the tube. He looked at me in startled amazement and he said, I told him 2 years ago I wanted to have contact, but I would not initiate it. The birth mother said she wrote a letter to the court 4 years before that. I went back to that clerk of court because he was so afraid, you know, he was going to open up the cable words, told him what had happened, told him that there's a letter, nobody knows where the letter is. I went to the attorney with my daughter and told him what I felt, and I said if I was not a Christian, I would kill you because I could have more rights by shooting you and being taken to the jail across the street than I have by sitting here being a productive, law-abiding citizen. And I said, I hope someday I can find in my heart to forgive you. I gave him a picture of the baby, and I said, this is what you've taken away from me because you chose to play God. And so, I don't know if that has helped any of you figure out what it is, but I guess if we work together, I'm bound and determined this isn't going to ever happen to anybody else. The agency won't even speak to me anymore, and new hope is no hope.
Thank you very much. Would people who want to speak maybe just come up here if you know you want to talk? I mean, that's such a poignant testimonial, really, to the way in which society and the legal system have absolutely nothing to do with what is really good and healthy.
Well, nobody has any rights, that's what I found out.
That's right.
Nobody. It's just amazing.
That's right.
Well, I'm a birth mom first, and then I had a daughter within marriage, and then I adopted a son. So I've got three situations, I guess. And I waited for 30 and a half years for my son to find me because I was conditioned by social workers in society believing I had no rights to look for him. And you're right, your grieving never stops. I think it's a lifelong process, just like adoption is a lifelong process. And through the reunion, which was 4 years ago almost, that has been perfect. And that part I can't go on with my life because my son and I do have a good relationship. But I lost a grandson that I never knew. And that was tough. I wasn't going to do this.
We all do this, you know, we start out.
And my daughter, who was born in my marriage, will have nothing to do with my first son. So that's a loss. And my husband has finally divorced me. So that's another loss. But the grieving, I've started the grieving process. And believe it or not, I don't look like it, but I'm much healthier inside today than I was for 30 years. And I feel now I can't get on with my life. My youngest son, whom I adopted, is now getting close to 30. And after my reunion, I did a search for his birth mother and found her and gave him the information. And darn it, he won't use it. I think probably he's holding back a lot because of what happened between my husband and I. I think he doesn't perhaps want to cause any more problems for his adopted father. I'd like to meet her, I'd like to know her, but I can't. That's his search and he has to do it. But there's a lot of grief in this process, and I think openness could change the whole kit and caboodle. And I hope that social workers that are here will look at that and correct the mistakes. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we going to get some social workers up here, I hope?
I have a question and a comment on something that you said.
Right.
I hope I didn't misunderstand you, but I thought I understood you to say that when you find the body or the relationship or whatever, then you can deal with it and you can grieve and you can bury it and you can get over the grief.
The beginning, right?
Whenever you can, if ever. I heard this lady say that, and I don't mean to make a judgment on you, but what you're saying with your lips, that you buried that baby, and what's coming through in every other way is that
No, I'm
that
trying to
baby,
bury the 3 days, and I'm trying to do that. I haven't really done it. I've tried to do those to try and get on.
you tried.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I'm saying. Just because you find the body doesn't mean that you can bury it. It's like any other relationship, is what you said, which brought to mind, it's not like any relationship that you have with a boyfriend or a husband or a friend, a girlfriend, because you are flesh and blood with this child. And no matter what, you're going to have that connection. And they are not dead, and you can't bury it. That's denial. And you are stuck in this grief.
What I'm telling you is that if you found the child dead, then you could bury it.
Okay, I didn't
Okay,
understand.
it's
you
very
saying
concrete.
That there was a physical death there.
Yeah.
I thought you meant.
No, I'm talking about the old-fashioned find the body, have the funeral, and bury it, and know that it's dead. And in
If the
it,
person is really physically dead?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. No, these people. We don't know that any of these people are dead yet, right? Very few actually turn out to be dead, although some do. But no, that's right.
Okay.
Okay.
I have this fear that maybe the baby has died and they won't even tell us. So see, that's another.
Well, that's what an awful lot of, particularly birth mothers have said for many, many years. Look, would you just please tell me my baby's all right? You know, give me some, let me know.
Came and found and asked if our daughter was okay. The whole 21 years we had
Right.
her. Nobody checked on her.
That's right. I think this lady is going to come up.
I have some new perspective for you to think about, and hopefully I'll give some of you some encouragement. I'm not a clinician, but I am an adoptee, an adoptive parent, and I have 2 natural children of my own. I should probably define the sequence a little. I was 6 and a half when when I was adopted, my birth mother walked out and my father and brothers and myself. And then I was rejected by my adoptive parents. And when I was 19 and engaged, somebody from my previous family decided it was time for me to know the truth about why I had been given up. Well, this particular person had a conscience to clear, and it was important to her to clear her conscience in the fact that she had placed a want ad in the newspaper, and that's how we had been adopted by this inappropriate family. Emotionally, I was not ready. It terrified me. I had been told by adoptive parents that my natural parents were these dreadful people, and to have this woman come out of this dreadful background that I had and tell me, now it's time to know everything. I just knew I wasn't ready. I corresponded for a short time with my birth mother, and I felt safe. I was on the East Coast and she was on the West Coast, and discovered very early on that she and I had different values regarding family. One of her letters said, well, my 16-year-old daughter is getting married and we're so happy, I just love babies, which I thought was a little ironic since she'd given away 3 of them. Anyway, I, having felt unloved and lots of rejection, felt that it wasn't because I was adopted. It wasn't my fault. So one of my goals was to adopt. Well, I got pregnant before I ever thought about adopting, and had 2 children, and they were boys, so obviously they should have a sister. I adopted a little girl who was 2 and a half, because I felt, having been an older child, I would be able to offer her more. And then I decided she needed a sister, so I ended up with 2 children, adopted, and 2 of my own. Well, for 45 years, I had a real tough time with feeling good about myself, having good self-image, fearing rejection. It was hard for me to get close to anybody, let alone myself even. And so I worked really hard on improving my own self-image. I went to seminars, I read a lot. I really never had professional counseling. But in the process, I felt good enough about myself to start taking some risks. And so I was able to locate my paternal grandfather. I had learned that my natural father had died, thinking that I was probably the black sheep of the family, and he'd slam the receiver down on my call. He did not. We established a relationship, and through him I had half-brothers on my father's side. And just 2 weeks ago, I met half-sisters on my mother's side. And for over almost 50 years, I really didn't have a family I felt I could call my own. And now I have a lot of family. We're just getting acquainted. But in the meantime, my older adopted daughter, who's 25, wanted to search. And I reminded her that that's a risk. She was ready for it. And I said, if you're ready for that, go for it. She found her natural family this past year. I'm thrilled for her. People say, well, aren't you worried that you'll lose her love? And I told my daughter, and I tell my friends, in my heart, my adopted daughter will always be my daughter. Nothing, nobody can change that. But I've enriched her life by giving her the opportunity to find out about herself and to meet her natural family. And I feel real good about that. My younger daughter is 21. She thinks she wants to find her family, but she's not taking the steps. And I think it's wrong for me. And really my advice to you would be, when somebody is ready, they need to do it for themselves. Because there's a real emotional thing involved here. And I know it took me a long time to be ready enough to face the risk. And as I say, when I was 19, somebody wanted me to do it. And I was fortunate I didn't allow it to happen, really. And so give your adopted children time to go after what they need for themselves. But when it's important enough to them, they'll do it on their own. And in the meantime, for all of you who are grieving and suffering losses, work on yourself. Work hard at feeling better about yourself. Work hard at reaching out to others that you see need you. And look around you and ask yourself, what do I have to be thankful for? And that's what I did. I've been through, I'm in my second relationship. Ironically, I have a natural son who's rejected me. He and my ex-husband, who's very manipulative, have convinced him that for some reason I'm not acceptable. I have a granddaughter who's 3 I can't see, and I have twins on the way. I'm not giving up. I have hope that someday my son will be secure enough with himself and his life to ask himself, why have I rejected my mother? And I believe that someday that will happen. In the meantime, I'm grateful for the people I have in my life who love me and that I can love. And I work at continuing to feel good about myself.
Can I make just one comment on
Sure.
what she was saying? I think what you said about adoptee searching is so important because being involved in a search group in Grand Rapids, Michigan for 4 years now, it seems like adoptee-initiated searches go so much better in reunion than birth parent initiated. I'm not saying don't do it if you're a birth parent. I'm just saying, it seems like they go better if the adoptee, because the adoptee is then ready. I think most birth parents are always ready, most of them. A few aren't, but it seems like it works better the other way. Agree.
I'm an adoptee. I've completed my search, and I want to say that there's light on the other side of the tunnel, and that also what you had just said. One of the things that I spent a long time in analysis, and the woman who I worked with I think is really wonderful. She told me that she sees a reluctance, though, on the therapeutic community a lot of times to even want to deal with adoptees because the nature of the work is so long and so intensive that a lot of therapists today are not willing to make that kind of commitment and are gearing themselves more towards shorter therapy. The word that I didn't hear that helped for me, which also goes back to what you said in terms of initiating your own search, is that for me there was a basic issue of trust.
This marks the end of Session 6, Tape 1. Please turn now to Session 6, Tape 2.
I will give them information, I will give them names, I will give them beginnings of places to start, but I won't search for them, and I think it's wrong. And I think that when you present someone with a search like you're ready for when they're willing to go through it, you're taking away from them every little step, which is very, very important process in the rebuilding. And I mean, it's nice to have it, it's a nice gift to give somebody, but ultimately it can't be a gift, it has to be a labor, I think.
Are there any clinicians who have had an experience that we've just heard about or in their own community about reluctance in dealing with these issues with adoptees? Nobody has. It's all working just swimmingly. Do any of the clinicians here treat adoptees? Yes? Will you come up and say something?
I just want,
You can all come.
I just want to know how many even ask if the person is adopted.
I think you missed the beginning of the talk. That's one of my biggest things. People aren't asking.
That's it.
They're not
So how do they
asking?
know?
That's right. It's not on the intake sheets either, is it? That's right. It's not. Why isn't it routine? Do you have insomnia? Are you eating well? How are your relationships? Who are you married to? How many children do you have? Have you relinquished a child? Are you adopted? Are you all three? It's not asked, and it's bizarre. And we have to change that. The reason I'm singling you guys out is because we have to do that with the clinicians we know. We've got to really push them with this. And when a birth mother, who I know very well, said to me, her therapist said to her, "Come on, you've got to grieve. Let's go here, let's grieve." And she said, wait, what am I grieving? At the same time, her daughter came and found her, and the whole thing was thrown upside down. But there they were arguing about what this therapist wanted her to do, and which was unrealistic.
One way that I networked for about 10 years, I had a bed and breakfast, and I got a lot of professionals on vacation. And that was one of the issues that I always brought up. Do you ask? And the answer has always been, well, no. And I said, would you please start asking? So maybe I've only reached a very few, but I mean, that's my one big thing, is to reach all of them. I even had the leading psychiatrist from Israel at my place. So, I mean, I just network that way. Anyway, I'll go back.
Okay, you don't have to go back.
What's the question?
What's the question? Well, we were going to respond to your comment about our therapists dealing with the issue of adoption in our community, or are they willing to get into it, or are they just pushing it aside?
Well, I can only speak from my perspective, which is a little slanted, because I run a program, Post-Adoption Resources, specifically for education, consultation, counseling for triad members and professionals. In addition to being a therapist, I'm also an adoptee. So in our community, when people come to our program, they are coming specifically recognizing that they have either issues or the need to connect with others. Now, in our community, which is Detroit, we feel pretty fortunate that the idea of adoption and post-adoption is finally coming out of the closet. And it's really happening from a combination of a lot of issues. Triad members are coming out of the closet more. The professionals are starting to recognize that there are specific unique issues. That does not mean that there's enough education. There isn't. It's just really beginning to happen. It's known in the child welfare organizations, the child welfare agencies, people who deal with adoption, either placement of infants, the agencies where the families are coming back, and of course the issues of special needs, older children. Where we're fighting to make it happen is out of the child welfare, in the schools, in the universities, in private clinics, in child and adolescent clinics, those types of organizations. And that's what all of us are trying to have happen. Because the social workers and the agencies know we're there. That doesn't always mean that they're responding in the most helpful way to us, but they know that we are there. Some of them would like us to be more active and involved because they would like to be supportive to us, but they're afraid of breaking the law. And I know that to be true, so we have to really work from a legislative aspect as well as an education aspect. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, I would just, it's just that I don't know why they're reluctant. I think I was just saying that it was an observation more than anything, that people are reluctant to see a therapy that could be a 2 or 3 year therapy, that now they're looking at an 8 or 9 year therapy, depending on other issues that are around it. And there's a reluctance of people to take on someone for that time.
Oh, you're talking about a therapist?
Yeah, the actual personal investment that the therapist has to make.
And I think it just depends on the type of therapist, because not even dealing with adoption issues, there's some therapists who just work in a 6 to a year
interval, and they believe that that's long-term therapy, and then you have others who have people in therapy for their entire life. And that's their philosophy. And I personally don't believe somebody needs to be in therapy for their entire life. They need to enter, and when things are somewhat resolved, to be able to leave and then come back again when certain things come up. Because it allows us to have some independence. Now, the whole issue of post-adoption, I've been in and out of this particular room, and the pain that people are feeling. I've been coming to AAC for a number of years. I know a lot of faces and people here. And besides coming to the presentation, it doesn't answer the particular question, but it's real important. Some of you I know have been here before and you have connections within your group in your city. For others, this might be a first-time experience. And even for the people who continue to come back, hearing other people's experiences and hearing the pain resurfaces things for people even though they might have had some resolution. So reach out. Don't go to lunch by yourself. Grab somebody in the hallway and just start to connect with people, because in addition to the support and the energy that we get from the presentations, we need to support each of us on a personal level as well.
Thanks, Linda.
I just wanted to say something about a Boston analyst who was a teacher of my husband's, who showed up at our Boston conference. He's a man who's in his 70s now, and I really didn't understand why he would be coming to our conference. We tried to figure it out to no avail. And later on, he was introduced to me by our search group leader as Dr. So-and-so, who had just been reunited with his daughter. And would I like to meet his daughter? Well, later on, this gentleman who is very well known in our community wrote a letter to us saying that he had trained as a psychoanalyst. He'd been analyzed twice. He had a large family. He had an enormous practice. He was a beloved teacher. But no one ever helped him with the relinquishment that took place the first year of his residency, when his daughter was given up by the birth mother against his wishes. And he said that no amount of treatment had ever made any difference, and that here he was at 70 or whatever, and he felt as though his life had begun over again. And I mean, that is, I'm not knocking psychotherapy, but I am knocking a psychotherapy that does not deal with the correct issues. And that I feel, as an adoptee myself and as an educator and a therapist, that those of us who are in there have got to make changes within the profession, that we have to insist upon it. And if we have the power to get the intake sheet changed, we've got to do that. You people are the brave ones who tell the truth. You're the ones, we're not having any trouble here acknowledging loss. You're not the people who come into the clinic and say, gee, I don't know why I don't feel too well. That's not where you're at all. So I think we can have a couple of more comments, and then we should probably stop, okay? Thank you for waiting so long.
I should say first that I'm here in my capacity as a journalist. I'm also an adoptee. And I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the changes that are happening now in adoption for all triad members and the women's movement and the historical influence that's had. One of the issues that I've run up against as I've investigated this is that, in contrast to what I'm hearing here, that the women's movement has, by consciousness raising and encouraging speaking out and coming out of the closet, has broached open the subject for so many people, and I agree with that completely. The other thing that I've heard, not here, but before, is that adoptees have to realize, especially those of us born in the 1940s and 50s, that reproductive choices were so limited to women at that time that the only thing that they were given for going through an illegitimate pregnancy, which was at that, the social atmospheres in the 50s when I was born, was so incredibly regressive to women that the only thing that they were offered in exchange was privacy. And so we have to realize, I've been told as an adoptee, I have to realize in going through research that to understand the historical moment about what an illegitimate pregnancy and giving up a child meant in the 1950s, something far different than it would mean for me now if I had an unplanned pregnancy. So feminism teaches us something else too. And I'd be interested in exploring some of that with you who are on all sides of the question. And then I have another, I guess, a kind of open question, which is that what I've found as an adoptee, and I should say that I've met with hostile rejection from my birth parents, who turn out to be married to each other, are quite wealthy, they threatened to sue the adoption agency. They gave me the information that I would be included in that lawsuit as well. Well, the therapeutic community that I've been in touch with has not been a very good conduit for information. So, for example, if I were to go to a therapist and deal with the psychological implications of that kind of rejection, I haven't been able to successfully find out certain material things like, can they sue me for finding out? Can they sue the adoption agency? So the legal aspects and the material aspects about adoption are not being addressed by the therapeutic community. So I'm really encouraged by your emphasis that the therapeutic community needs to get engaged in these issues and know more things. So it's only been a sort of adoptees advocates groups that have been able to answer questions for me, but those are hard to find. And if I can't go to my therapist and say, who should I contact to find out about these things, then it's been a lot of time in the public library trying to track things down sometimes. But there are certain issues that can't be found simply by opening the records. So I'm wondering if we should expand what we include in our Bill of Rights as adoptees, for example, to include other things. Even if the records were open, the kinds of questions that they asked birth parents 30, 40, 50 years ago don't reflect what they know now about heritability of certain things. For example, I've had some strange health problems that have, actually they know now, genetic components. Even if my health records were open to me, they didn't ask those kinds of questions then. So the only way I have access to information, some of it has been fairly life-threatening, would be to go through a search, find my biological relatives for myself and ask those questions now. And what does that mean as far as, what is the relationship between all that information that's out there that is not on the official field record? So that's my other open question.
Nobody's going to answer that, are they? Do you want to come up?
Just a short comment to therapists. I am a beginning therapist, a long-term adoptee, and a search helper and political activist in the middle in terms of time. Within the family system, and I'm not a complete subscriber to that, it is an exclusive approach to things, but there's certainly within the schematics and the geograms availability and documented nomenclature for adoption and the effect that has. And so I think that might also be an avenue politically in terms of local family therapist groups to try to make sure people are aware of and know about it and just simply question. And that might be a way to introduce that, at least in that segment of the therapy population. The other thing is I have a question for longer-term therapists who are part of the therapy. How in the world do you deal with your own issues and you're dealing with other people when they're identical? In many respects, I find that that's an increasing issue, and I'm questioning whether I can effectively do that.
One of the things that we did for the first time this year is that all of the clinicians who are teaching the clinical workshops are members of the triad. And I understand what you're saying. They call that countertransference, right?
Yeah, that's not all of it, but it's to a degree, but it's not all of it.
My feeling is that with any therapist, there are biases. And I think that all of us have got to have taken care of our own business before we become therapists. And and that's members of the triad or not. But on the other hand, I feel that what we have learned about ourselves, and one of the most wonderful things about this group and what, after all, this was about, was that all of us on all sides of the triad share the experience of loss. It is the most common denominator, I would argue, between the three of us. And it's like all those things, you know, if you can be treating a patient who you really don't, you don't know how to deal with, and it may not have anything to do with adoption. And you just, you do the best you can, while at the same time knowing that you've got something to offer the adoptee, let's say, that other therapists don't, and that you are now going to be in a position to teach them. And that's one of the things that is so thrilling, is to look through our AAC roster now, when we were planning this conference, and have the computer come up with 50 triad members who are therapists. And we did not all know one another, by the way, and it's a high time that we did. And here's one, for instance, Linda, who I didn't know, and she didn't know me either, but we need to get some power behind some of educating our own therapy community, I think.
I agree with Susan that any professional in their beginning stages needs to have some resolution around their own issues. But as an adoptee, working with other adoptees, working with birth parents, and working with adoptive parents, things resurface. Even if I was not an adoptee and I was working in those issues, your loss around your birth parents might hit another loss of mine that has nothing to do with adoption. So as a therapist, one still has to portray themselves. They still have to use their sense of self. Some people are more open about their own issues or not. But being able to recognize, is my gut churning because of the loss of that person, or the anger, or is it resurfacing some of the old stuff? Because nothing is ever 100% resolved. It re-triggers. And we just have to be more and more aware of the re-triggering. And the older I get, the more aware I am about that, And I'm sure probably when I get too old, it'll start to diminish. But we have to be concerned, and any good therapist needs to recognize that when they work with someone, things will resurface for them. Even when the issues, this particular subject is completely different. Anger, loss, sadness, rejection, acceptance, those are human type of issues that people deal with. And even though it might not be adoption, but I can connect much more. And I have to have support systems of my own, because my clients can be supportive, because I can learn from them and I can grow, but they're there to hear to hear from others. If it's a group, I can share with them some of my experiences, but I also have to recognize that if I'm in the role of the therapist or the counselor or the educator, I need to balance. I cannot, at least this is my philosophy, I cannot get the same thing from them, and shouldn't get the same thing from them that they are getting from me. Okay, we can give to each other to a certain amount, but if I have stuff, I need to go somewhere else for it, either professionally or personally with other friends. And that's my belief in regard to a good therapist anyways, that they're not using their client in an inappropriate manner. But we can grow and learn from our clients, and sometimes when a client's dealing with a certain issue, it resurfaces type things for me, and part of it can resurface in a very positive way. I can say to myself, or I can say to a client, I remember when I had that pain surface in that way. But given time and given some of the different ways to work with it, it can heal. And I can see the stages that some of my clients have gone through that I have gone through at an earlier time. So I can use that sense of self. But in any therapy, I think we have to be careful when we use sense of self, what is the purpose? Is it to help the client, or is it just because we need to talk about it? We need to talk about it and go somewhere else.
The other thing is, one of the things we want to get in position here at the AAC is that the education department would have some sort of referral sources of therapists who we know in the country know how to deal with these issues. It's true not only for adoptees, but for the so-called consumer. It's very difficult to find a therapist often who is right for you. And when you feel down and out, it's real hard to go in there and say, well, you know, I don't think I like you, I think I'll try another one. It's very hard. And at the moment, I think my advice to all of you who feel that you don't get enough, let's say, support in your support group, that you would ask people in your support group who they would recommend, and if they don't know, if they're not sure, that you call the AAC and see whether one of us from these different parts of the country can steer you in direction of someone who really can get with the issues. It's unfortunate, but it's true that not every therapist is going to understand. And yes, it is loss, and that is something that they have been trained in, but it also is a kind of grief and loss that's very particular to the triad. It's also in some ways what holds us together. Thank you all very much.
Let me just see if I can turn this thing off. Is that an off, do you think?